Hey everyone, welcome to the recap episode of Too Complicated for History. This is our 6th episode coming at you, not live. So, this episode of Too Complicated for History, the one with Rosie Zagari that we just listened to, was an incredible episode to me. I've said episode a lot of times, so I'll say it a few more times. Episode. It really made me think about the name Too Complicated for History. We talked about Thomas Law, and talking about his life at every turn made me go, wow, this is complicated. Hold on, let's get into that. And I really understood, and then on an even deeper level, like why there are figures in history that really are just too complicated to do an episode about, to do a show about. I mean, this will take as long as it takes to live it, a lifetime to really unpack in a way. But I think one of the main things about it is this guy was an adventurer, right? He's making history around the world, and it kind of put him in a very unique spot. He's part of our history. He pops up in other cultures' history. He had elements of being ahead of his time, but as Rosie pointed out, that's a relative term. So I kind of want to just talk about some of these complicated nature of who he was and how there were some contradictions into who he was. He was so forward thinking in some ways, but in other ways he was controversial. Fill me in a little bit.
Lynn, do you want to take this?
Sure. That's a lot, Jordan.
It's a lot. I mean, it's a dense episode, and I think there's so much
better,
more to
Jordan.
say.
We need guidance.
Well, the first thing I'll say is that thankfully Rosie Zagari is writing a book on Thomas Law. So all of these things that we can't get to or that need more, information, fortunately, we'll have a book on that. So hopefully when she writes the book, we can all read it and then have her back and, dig deeper into some aspects. I think what fascinated me about Thomas Law is he had this whole career in India, and I didn't realize that there were tons of British for the East India Company over in British India, and that they didn't get married to local women. I can't remember the term that Rosie used that was appropriate. We'll just say partnered up.
I think we agreed on the episode. Companion.
Okay. Yes. And he had, I believe, 3 children with her. And so he has this whole family, this whole life over in India. And then he, goes over to the United States and goes over to the Capitol. And I think the thing that I wanted to know about that, of course, we don't know because I always like the things that are the most difficult to find out is he took the children. So these are now mixed race children. He took the children with him. What happened to the companion? She just, she likely wanted her children to have a better life. And I guess she thought going with him over to, the United States, but still, what happened to her? So he comes over to the US and he ends up marrying into the family of George Washington. That's crazy.
Complicated.
And then George Washington's granddaughter ends up the stepmother of his mixed race children. And he also had a lot to do with the early Washington, D.C. and the creation of the Capitol. And I think it just kind of, one time it blows my mind that he did so much, but at the other side, I love how it sort of takes this huge idea of empire and it sort of puts it down into something more manageable, because we're talking about empire, but we're talking about, British India and the United States, the ex-British, part of the ex-British Empire, and the connections that are there, because I certainly didn't know much about the connection between India and the United States in the way that Rosie talked about.
Yeah. I mean, it was, what a mixed bag, right? Like Thomas Law is all over the map. I remember when we originally started talking about him, how it was like, oh, this is a human that perfectly fits the mold of our show. And it's really cool to see that, like, it's not really cool. It's interesting to me that like mixed race on two different continents, right? I guess three actually, um, are so different, and how it was also not just a modern thing that happens, right? Like this
Mhm.
was definitely happening in the past, and it's not something you hear about often. It's not something that's really talked about. And like the fact that one of his sons became a lawyer, right, who started helping natives and enslaved people. Like, I thought that was awesome. Um, and how, he's like, don't, you can't get married or you can't have kids out of wedlock. That's absolutely not to his kids. But then his kids are from out of wedlock.
Mhm.
And also being a part of, the East India Company and the British Empire, and then coming over here and marrying into the family that literally fought its way away from the British Empire. I, I don't know. Is this guy like the best con man that's ever existed? Is he, he had progressive thinking relative to the time. Um, he didn't necessarily have uh, equality in his mind as far as like, everyone's equal, but man, it was a really fun episode. He was so fascinating in so many different ways. And this episode is packed to the brim. In fact, it's a little longer than our typical episode because we were so engaged throughout the process. But yeah, I mean, I think he's a delightful candidate for our show, and it was really fun to have him on. Yes, Thomas Law was on the show. He was talking to us
through
um,
Rosie, we did a little
yeah,
seance.
through Rosie. It was so great having Rosie, and we're so excited for her book to come out. TBD, but
Yes.
absolutely we'll have her back on when when that's coming up.
Yeah, and I
I
like that we came up with that she mentioned the change in this idea of race, which I think is really important in the 19th century, because in the 18th century, so the 1700s, race was more fluid. It was more mutable. Someone could pass for different races. It was something that was changing, whereas she mentions how in the 19 episode it becomes scientific, so they create this scientific racism that all of a sudden is sort of etched in stone, that you are biologically, physically different than this person because of your race. And she doesn't talk a lot about it, but it's definitely sort of that nugget that makes you want to go out and learn more about this change, and sort of what he saw happening, as well as what happened in the U.S. as far as um, ideas of race and
Yeah.
the creation of
It's
it.
like a regression in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you know what? She has a line in the show that we actually used in our trailer, that progress is not this linear thing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's such a poignant and profound thing to say. And if you look at just the US's history, it's definitely at times two steps forward, one step back,
Right.
one step forward, two steps back. It's a really interesting and important thing to know, because it's so easy for us. I mean, progress in anything isn't linear. And it's so easy to get caught up in the idea that like I take the steps, I move towards the goal. When in actuality, it's like I take the steps, I get injured, I have to sit down, right? Or I
Right.
need to go back because I dropped, my shoe fell off, or it's this, it's a wax and wane of tides almost, right? And it's like it's good to remember and have that perspective when you feel like things aren't necessarily going your way, that there are ups and downs.
Right.
Hopefully more ups than downs. And that's also not always the case. So but knowing that also makes it easier to understand how these things happen. So
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would imagine with his life and how he approached it, and I don't want to say, um, well, yeah, contradictions in the sense that he says one thing, does another, and how he lived his life. Like that must make his political ideology a little complicated too, right? And then he marries into the Washington family. I mean, geez, like as you said, Pat, this is a very great candidate for our show because of how complicated all this is. I mean, I would be nervous in that environment to have someone marry into my family, though I think Rosie did a very good job of saying that it seemed to be all about the love. It seemed very legitimate and all of that, but I don't know if I could shake the feeling.
Well, and on that note, I don't think we mentioned it. She mentions it briefly. They ended up getting divorced as well.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Do
I
we
mean,
know
if you
why?
want a conspiracy theory, he's the perfect guy for it.
Yeah.
I mean, she does say that Eliza, which is George Washington's granddaughter, was a very difficult woman, but it's not saying Thomas Law wasn't difficult in his own right. So this like love story that occurs obviously doesn't end as well as we might have hoped.
And also the fact, even just the fact that they got divorced is like a nuance to the time that is not a regular thing. Like if you heard that two political families, there was a marriage, and then they get divorced, and there's a big lawsuit, and like some kids are being taken care of, others aren't. That sounds like today,
right?
And in fact, it was not. It's like he's like the modern man transported. He's not the modern man transported back, but there are a lot of modern happenings around him. And also the fact that he goes into multiple business endeavors and that he walks out unscathed, but he's like his business partners have been corrupted or bankrupt. Like, goodness gracious, what is this guy doing? He goes to India, starts a family, abandons the woman, comes to the US, marries into a high profile family, starts a few businesses. They all fail. The marriage fails. I don't know. It's like a reality show, honestly.
Yeah.
It's
so what
really
is this?
funny.
What is this movie coming out?
Yeah.
Or maybe it should be a series. I don't know.
Stay tuned.
But I feel like it's very modern. I mean, I feel like it's something that we could all relate to.
I was going to say that as one of the things I was going to ask you guys, but then the reason I didn't is because I feel like I've said that before. Like, oh, this feels very modern. And what I'm realizing in this moment from this conversation is a lot of these complicated characters from history feel modern. Why? And I think the answer is, this is just my opinion, is because history does a bad job of telling us the full rounded picture of who these people were. The reason they feel modern is because they're complicated like human beings, and historical figures we read about or hear about in history classes are always so one-dimensional that we think that all these characters from history are one-dimensional. So are they really modern, or is it just that we don't ever do a good job of presenting history as being, we say, oh, it was 250 years ago. It was only 250 years ago. We're not talking about people from the year 2.
Yeah. So just to answer that, I think let's change the word modern to they feel like people. They feel human. And so we understand the modern human and the way they're presented in books oftentimes, or the way it's often presented in broad sweeping generalizations, is just a career path, and you just hear the milestones of what they've done. Right. And so Jordan's cat is going crazy in the back. That's awesome. It's like camera shaking. It's a cat earthquake. Is that, we understand each other and we have that context. And so by humanizing these people, which we've talked about before, it does change the perception, and it makes, in a way, it makes us feel, to me, it feels less special. Like I'm less special, or like they're less special. And, it kind of goes both ways, and that people are people going people. And at the same time, it's like, it's just reality, right? Like we are just people. I don't know. That's not the most profound thought I've had. People are going to people. We are people. But it is just, it's really, we're taking abstract ideas that these people are, and we're turning them into humans that I can relate to and understand. And that makes it more interesting, more compelling, more dramatic, and more fun.
Well, and really, we feel human to each other because we understand our own thoughts and those around us who share their thoughts. And we don't get that from history. But when you see their thoughts played out as actions, right? Do as I say, not as I do, and those types of things. That's where we get that layer, that peeled back layer of like, oh, this guy was having some thoughts there, Well, and again, I don't mean for that statement to be one dimensional. I mean it though. I mean, when else do we get that? Hasn't it been our endeavor to figure out what these people were thinking, feeling from history, and not just what they wrote down, but what the intention was behind the word, like.
Well, I think one thing that strikes me the more I visit historic sites and the more I learn about individuals is that we today really give ourselves way too much credit that we're so far advanced from these individuals. Sure, we have this technology that they would not comprehend, but a lot of things we have are just more technological or faster, more efficient versions of what they had or what they created. I think some people think they sort of, crawl out of their cave in the morning, put on their hoop skirts, and they're freezing and they, have to go hunt and eat raw,
And it's literally
rabbits.
what I
And
did yesterday, by the way.
well, yeah, well, that's you, Jordan. You got to stop eating raw rabbits.
All right, I'm sorry.
And
That's what happens when you move 45 miles away from a grocery store.
Yeah, exactly.
You got to move to a city, Jordan. And so I think we give ourselves this credit that we are so far advanced, but then when you go back and you look at what, people in, Thomas Law's 18th century, what they had a lot of the same things we do. They're just in a different form. And they had a lot of the same thoughts. They had the same relationships. I think it's a way to bring those people in the past up to where we think we are and maybe, take us down a few pegs to realize we're really not that special.
And that's
well,
such
maybe
a great point.
Jordan's special, but
yeah, exactly. Yeah, there was definitely always a group punching bag. So Jordan, take solace that
Yeah.
We're just kidding. We love Jordan, but Lynn, you bring up a good point about like we're no better. We just have more technology, and I would, everyone's like, well, what would they do if they saw cell phones, And after the initial shock, they'd probably just use cell phones, right? So it's give the man a tool, and he's going to use it, and it reminds me of a story of George Washington, where like there's been conjecture that or perception that he didn't like his mother. And it was like because he didn't want his mother to live with him at his house. It's like, based on everything else, especially from what I've seen, from your research, Lynn, like, no, he had a very important and good relationship with his mother. How many of our audience want their mother to come and live with them as adults now, especially, as our parents get older? I love my mom. She's one of my best friends, but also I could never, we could not live in the same house unless it was, a 14-room mansion in which she's in the West Wing and there's a courtyard separating the houses. You know what I mean? So,
and the spouse has to agree to it. So
yeah, exactly. So, it's just like, that's not a uniquely modern sentiment. Right. And it's something that, as you learn more, it's like, oh, okay, that's what was happening then. So anyway, all of that to be said, we are not special. We have better technology. And
they're basically,
time is a flat circle. The world is meaningless in
and that's the takeaway.
Yeah.
No,
As things change, it
but
all stays the same. Yeah.
yeah, but you know what? And again, this sounds trivial, but I certainly don't mean it that way. Those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it, and we have seen that play out in literally this episode. That, oh, that sounds familiar. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I think you literally said that, Lynn. That sounds remarkably familiar. So it's good to pay attention to these words. Now, in the interest of time, because this is a complicated episode and there is so much more to say on it, I do hope we have Rosie Zagari back to continue the conversation. Please read her book when it comes out. We'll have more to say on it then. And check out the episode if you haven't already on Thomas Law featuring Rosie Zagari. And thank you both for joining me today. I look forward to doing this again next week.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thanks, Jordan.
Mm-hmm.